Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Why can't we all just get along? Oh, if only I had $1 for every time my mother asked that question of my 3 siblings and myself. I would be a rich man. You see, we didn't get along very often. We fought, we bickered and argued, and we seldom spent more than a few hours together without an argument breaking out among us. As you can imagine, family vacations were particularly fun for my mom and dad. 4 kids crammed into the family car and forced to spend prolonged periods of quality time together, in close quarters. Moses must have felt a lot like my dad, except his family numbered in the millions, and the number of daily disputes left Moses feeling overwhelmed and ready to turn in his title as the deliverer of Israel. This poor man was required by God to lead a veritable host of hostile, perpetually unhappy campers who had made a national sport out of bickering and complaining. And while Moses had hired extra help to handle the caseloads from all the disputes, the interpersonal climate among the people of Israel had not exactly taken a turn for the better. And Moses knew that if they couldn't learn to get along, they would never get far in their quest to conquer the nations of Canaan. At that time I said to you, I am not able to bear you by myself. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are today as numerous as the stars of heaven. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, make you 1,000 times as many as you are, and bless you, as he has promised you. How can I bear by myself the weight and burden of you and your strife? Choose for your tribes wise, understanding, and experienced men, and I will appoint them as your heads. And you answered me, the thing that you have spoken is good for us to do. So I took the heads of your tribes, wise and experienced men, and set them as heads over you, commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds, commanders of 50s, commanders of 10s, and officers throughout your tribes. And I charged your judges at that time, hear the cases between your brothers, and judge righteously between a man and his brother, or the alien who is with him. You shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. You shall not be intimidated by anyone, for the judgment is God's. And the case that is too hard for you, you shall bring it to me, and I will hear it. And I commanded you at that time all the things that you should do. Deuteronomy 1, verses 9 through 18. Moses is standing on the edge of the land of Canaan, addressing the next generation of Israelites who have arrived at the border and are facing the prospect of having to do what their predecessors had failed to do, enter the land. As part of his speech to the people, Moses recounts their journey from Mount Sinai, where God had made his covenant with them. It was there that God had given them his law and had instructed them. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Exodus 19, verse 5. Unlike the covenant God had made with Abraham concerning the land, this covenant, sometimes referred to as the Mosaic covenant, was bilateral and conditional. In other words, it was a covenant that required a commitment from both parties. Each had to keep their end of the agreement. If the people obeyed God's law, he would bless them. They would be his chosen possession. But if they failed to obey, there would be serious ramifications. And Moses subtly reminds them that God had kept his covenant commitment to Abraham. He had promised to make of Abraham a great nation, and all they had to do was look around for the proof of God's faithfulness. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are today as numerous as the stars of heaven. Deuteronomy 1, verse 10. God had greatly prospered them. In fact, in the opening verses of the book of Exodus, Moses provides the historical context that when Jacob and his family had fled to Egypt to escape the famine in Canaan, there had only been 70 of them. But by the time Joseph had died and God sent Moses to deliver the people from their captivity in Egypt, we're told the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Exodus 1, verse 7. The faithfulness of God to keep his covenant commitment to Abraham was clearly visible in the sheer number of Israelites who stood before Moses that day. He reminded them that their God had kept his word and had made them exceedingly fruitful. So much so that the people in Canaan feared the people of Israel, even before they set foot in the land. When Joshua eventually sent 2 spies to reconnoiter the city of Jericho, a resident of the city confessed to them, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Joshua 2, verses 9 through 11. God had multiplied them. He had delivered them from captivity. He had led them across the wilderness, feeding, clothing, and protecting them all along the way. And He had given them victories over their enemies on the east side of the Jordan. Now, it was time to cross over and take possession of the land. But there was a problem. God's blessing had become a burden for Moses. There were so many of them that he had become overwhelmed. But it wasn't their numbers that was the cause of his headaches. It was their tendency to whine and complain. In fact, Moses put it in extremely blunt terms. But you are such a heavy load to carry. How can I deal with all your problems and bickering? Deuteronomy 1, verse 12. This had been a problem from day one. Ever since Moses had led the people out of Egypt, they had displayed a strong propensity to express their displeasure. They complained about anything and everything, from the manna and quail God miraculously supplied for food, to the man God had provided to lead them. And Moses reminded them that there had been a day when his father-in-law had given him some wise counsel. He had advised Moses to choose from the people capable men, God-fearing, men of truth, those who hate bribes, and put them over the people as rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. Exodus 18, verse 21. And Moses had done just that. But while the people had agreed with the decision made by Moses, it's clear that they continued to grumble and dispute. Even with the appointment of additional judges, there were too many disputes to handle. And this speaks volumes regarding the spiritual state of the people of Israel. They were a disgruntled people because they were a disobedient people. Jesus summed up the entire law with the following statement: You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And a second is equally important: love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these 2 commandments. Matthew 22, verses 37 through 40. The people of Israel were failing to live up to the law of God. They were not loving Him or loving one another. They were too busy disputing and disagreeing with one another, and their lack of love for one another was a reflection of their lack of love for God. The Apostle John put it this way: If someone says, I love God, but hates a fellow believer, that person is a liar. For if we don't love people we can see, how can we love God whom we cannot see? 1 John 4, verse 20. Moses had clearly and repeatedly communicated God's expectations, but he was so busy handling disputes and disagreements among the people that he had been forced to appoint additional referees to deal with the volume of issues taking place. How in the world were they going to possess the land if they couldn't even get along with one another? What good were their formidable numbers going to be against their enemies if they couldn't even stop fighting among themselves? The promised land lay before them, but their greatest obstacle wasn't going to be the occupants of the land. It was going to be the members of their own faith community. What God had intended as a blessing, they had turned into a burden. Rather than enjoying the camaraderie of godly community, they experienced conflict and strife. And instead of Moses spending his time leading the people in battle against their enemies, he was wasting his time solving disputes among brothers. And as we'll see, the track record of God's people was far from stellar. There were other issues that Moses will raise up as he recaps the less than flattering history of Israel to this point. The promised land lay spread before them, but a litany of broken promises lay behind them. Were they ready to change? Were they prepared to obey God and keep His commands? He was faithful. But would they be?